Welcome to the Bitter Medicine Podcast, where it's all about Black empowerment. Our show focuses on Black news and entertainment, arts, science, economics, history, people, and strategies that uplift, empower, and motivate Africans within the diaspora. And now your host, whose favorite color is black, Goku.
Welcome back to the Bitter Medicine Podcast. I am your host, Goku. Today's show, we will be discussing, comparisons of African kingdoms. Welcome back. Hopefully we have an engaging chat room conversation by double question mark today. If you were here last time, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Hope everyone's fine today. Before we do begin, though, I want to remind you guys that this podcast is a part of a podcast network, and that I'd like you guys to support all the other shows on the network. Let's start here.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-Black perspective, where Black problems are addressed with Black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
A big echo. That's probably because I have the microphone and the desktop audio on. So I'll turn that off for now. Tell me if there's a difference. That's the thing when you're running these shows, man. There's a thousand. Well, a thousand is saying too much, but there's a gang of things that you got to do all at once. So it's it can be difficult sometimes to. It can be difficult sometimes to nail everything, right? Before we get started, I want to show you this brief video on African kingdoms that I found on YouTube. All right, so take a listen to this. Okay, it seems like that's not coming through. It's set up correctly. I don't know what the deal is. It's all good. What we'll do is we'll just get into the reading of the paper. Let me turn off the video. The video is playing on my end well, but it's not coming through in the broadcast, I guess. So it's all good. We'll just do the reading instead. The video was short anyway. It was like a 3-minute video talking about African kingdoms, the 5 powerful kingdoms to know. So you guys could look that up if you want to on YouTube. Tony just said in the chat, yeah, I did actually. I did, but it's all good. It was just a short video, like I said, 3-minute. You can look it up on YouTube. Just talking about the 5 kingdoms you should know, giving some brief information. In any event, here we are with this week's paper, or this Saturday's paper. A comparison of African kingdoms. Again, I want to thank you guys for being here. Thanks to Onita Say in the chat room, giving me feedback on what's working, what's not working. I appreciate it. All right. So, a comparison of African kingdoms by J. VANSINA. I'm pretty sure I read a paper by J. VANSINA a couple weeks ago, a week or 2 ago. So let's see what this paper teaches us today. It has long been recognized that there is a distinctive category of African political systems which is characterized by centralized authority. The preliminary analysis and classification of African kingdoms proposed in this article are based on comparison of most of the states in Central, South, and East Africa. Only a few data on West African kingdoms have been incorporated, but we feel that the classification will prove generally valid for West Africa as well. So you got to understand that you're going to hear a lot about the Arabized African nations probably in this paper, since that they don't incorporate a lot of West African kingdoms, and that's something I plan to delve into in a future episode, a little bit more detailed. Well, West African kingdoms, considering that most of us out here, outside the continent, we came from West Africa originally. So I'll talk about that in a future episode. So we come to the section here that talks about the common characteristics of African kingdoms. M. Fortes and E. Evans Pritchard define kingdoms or states, which they label Group A, by the criteria of centralized authority, administrative machinery, and judicial institutions, in short, a government, in which cleavages of wealth, privilege, and status correspond to the distribution of power and authority. This opposed Group A to Group B, segmentary structures which have no central government or sharp divisions of rank, status, or wealth. Nadal characterized the states by territorial sovereignty, centralized government, specialized administrative staff, and the monopoly of the legal use of force. The monopoly of the legal use of force. So when you hear that stated in that way, when you hear it stated in that way, that you know that's a reference to a European thought. And I'm drawing a blank on the European that stated it that way. The monopoly of legal use of force. Is it Weber? I can't remember now. Centralized authority or centralized government means only that the state must have a common head, the king, from whom all authority derives. It does not imply necessarily that there must be other central institutions besides the kingship, although there are central councils and courts in many cases. Before I go further, I want to hit on some of these footnotes. So when I glanced at the paper earlier, I noticed that the footnotes hold a lot of key information as well. So let's go back through this paragraph. M. Fortes and E. Evans Pritchard define kingdoms or states, which they label Group A by the criteria of centralized authority, administrative machinery, and judicial institutions, in short, a government, in which cleavages of wealth, privilege, and status correspond to the distribution of power and authority. This opposed Group A to Group B, segmentary structures, which have no central government or sharp divisions of rank, status, or wealth. And that brings us to footnote 3. Footnote 3. Which is C. Evans Pritchard, the divine kingship of the Shilluk. But that's not what I was trying to get at. No, 3 is up here, actually. Sorry. M. Fortes and E. Evans Pritchard, we have used kingdom and state as synonymous. It is possible to distinguish between the two terms. A state would then be a political organization where kinship ties are not used as a basic principle of organization in the pattern of delegation of authority. A kingdom would be any political organization which has a single hereditary head from which all authority stems. Used in those senses, not all states have to be kingdoms, nor would all kingdoms be states. But in Africa, all kingdoms seem in fact to be states, including even the celebrated Shilluk case. This is based to such an extent on inheritance of chieftainship in local dominant lineages that it can be seen as a case of segmentary lineage structure. But it is equally possible to stress the fact that whoever resides in an administrative unit, whatever his kin connections, accepts the authority of the local chieftain. Even this case can be considered to be a state. And then they reference this work, the Nilotes of the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, and you got the Anglo-Egyptian, okay. Which states that a borderline case should occur between different types of political organizations is to be expected. So this is the framework that this paper is working on, right? A kingdom being any political organization which has a single hereditary head from which all authority stems, right? So that's how they're defining a kingdom here. Not all states are kingdoms, and not all kingdoms are states. Let's go back to the, in fact, let me read the first 2 footnotes here. Footnote number 2, probably one would have to add a special class for the later sub-Saharan states where the kings are no longer sacred and where many of the details of administration seem to stem from Islamic models. A further doubtful case is the Mendi chiefdoms. It is said that there the chief is not sacred and that he shares political power with the local Poro secret society. The data are, however, confused, probably because the system had ceased to work effectively by the turn of the century. We think it quite possible that there was a final aspect of chiefship which manifested itself only in the inner lodge of the Poro and belonged either to the person who was described as a chief in the literature or to some other high-ranking official in the Poro, who would then be the equivalent of the divine king elsewhere. The chief would then be only a delegate of this king. But the available data in K. Little, the Poro Society as an Arbiter of Culture, Africana Studies, 1948, in his The Mende of Sierra Leone, London, 1951, are not clear. Right? So that gives us an idea of this idea of what a chieftain is, right? Historically. The relationship between the chieftain and the king, and that over time, this idea of this idea of the sacredness of the chiefdom or whatever kind of ceased. Okay, so let's get back to the paper. Administrative machinery consists in essence in a delegation of authority by the head of state to chiefs of smaller territorial units. The provinces, eventually to sub-chiefs or districts, and finally to headmen of villages. All right, so we see the hierarchy here. The inhabitants of the territorial subdivisions are not necessarily linked to their heads by ties of kinship, and kinship does not necessarily function as the basic principle of organization in the pattern of delegation authority. We should then define African kingdoms as sovereign political groups headed by a single leader who delegates authority to representatives in charge of the territorial units in which the country is divided. Okay, so that ties it together. So what we read in the footnotes a second ago gives you an idea that, you know, you have, in these African kingdoms, you have the sovereign head who dishes out levels of power to authorities that represent, you know, smaller territories within the kingdom. Right? If this definition is granted, it will be seen that all the kingdoms in Africa have much in common. First, pardon me. First, they all have a single leader, regarded as a divine king in the Fraserian sense, right? The Fraserian sense, with the possible exception of the Mendi and the exception of the more recent sub-Saharan states from Wadai to modern Songhai, right? So that's a footnote to that point, that there is some possible exceptions, I guess, amongst the Mendi people, right? I guess the Mendi people have more than one person at the top, more than one leader, right? The ideology of kinship is very much the same in all these systems. The king is thought of as enjoying special supernatural powers to which are linked the well-being of his kingdom. If he cannot exercise them, the country will suffer disaster in one form or another, right? Which is kind of what, if I'm not mistaken, the Native Americans also kind of dealt in, right? These supernatural powers are sometimes thought of as inherent in the kingship itself, or they are bestowed upon the king by appropriate doctoring. When they talk about doctoring, appropriate doctoring of the king is very frequent. And they point out a writing that talks about it. The case of the Kuba is illuminating, since some believe that the king derives his supernatural powers directly from the kingship, while others argue that he derives them from special doctrine. Probably both attitudes exist to some degree elsewhere as well. Associated with this basic belief are a number of other beliefs and customs. The kings are of divine origin, or at least ruled by divine right. Their persons are not sacred, but royalty is. And this is expressed by the existence of and the ritual paid of the royal regalia. Special rites, taboos, the custom of royal incest, the killing of old or sick king, the preserving of the growing parts of his body, nails and hair, are linked with the same belief. So this is new to me, right? The king is also a symbol of the kingdom, right? This footnote just leads you to another writing by E. Evans Pritchard. All right, this is already evidenced by the belief that his physical well-being is related to the prosperity of the country. It is expressed in the royal rituals, in the organization of the courts, in the layout of the capitals, and in the history of the kingdom itself. The king is the kingdom and such all the land belongs to him in the sense that he has ultimate control over it. Right? I'm going to give you a comparison of what the king sounds like to me in modern day in just a sec. All the people belong to him. He can command their labor and the products of the labor. He is their supreme judge and retains the power of life and death. But his power is not unlimited. Interesting. In most cases, his authority is balanced by other institutions, councils, and courts, which are said to represent the interests of the country whenever they conflict with the interests of the king as a person. You know, a lot of the preachers today sound like a lot of this description of the king, right? The symbol of the kingdom, etc. Right? The delegation of authority is generally a total delegation and comprises legislative, administrative, judicial, military, and even religious authority. Speaking of religion, chiefs hold authority because they receive it from the king. So, you know, I once heard, I can't remember if it was Hidden Colors or something, but I once heard someone say that, you know, the chiefs were kings, but the Europeans call them chiefs to kind of demote them, right? But we're seeing a little bit different here, right? Chiefs hold authority because they receive it from the king, and authority is often not thought of as divisible into parts. In their provinces, they will give justice, raise tribute, issue laws, sometimes even wage war, and be considered generally as owners of their subjects, their labor, their goods, and their land, all through the one act of delegation. So you see that the chieftain, or the chiefs, have powers similar, right? In their territories, they have powers similar to African kings, but they have that power via or bestowed to them from the African king. They're not kings themselves, but they have power that represents the king. And that makes sense, actually. Right? If you have people, if you have a territory that stretches over a great deal of land, and you have these representatives who are your chiefs, they need to hold a power that represents the kind of power that you wield overall. Right? They are an extension or continuation of who you are. Sub-chiefs receive delegation of authority in the same way from the chiefs, and they delegate it further to the headmen of the villages. This delegation of authority may descend for a maximum of 3 territorial levels below the king if the kingdom is large. Yeah, that's what I'm getting at, right? But 2 levels, did I miss anything here? But 2 levels or even 1 may be sufficient, and the king then delegates his authority directly to the village headman. In the footnote to that, a case with 3 levels is Rwanda, or Bamba with 2 levels, Cuba with 1, Shaga, right, Cuba with 1, Shaga. If there is no delegation of authority at all, i.e. if the king is headman of a sovereign village, we should not include the case as a state. Delegation of territorial authority is to us an essential characteristic of a state. All right, so they're telling you what their metric of a state is, and thus what their metric of a kingdom is, once again. Both the delegation is not always total. But the delegation is not always total. In cases like Rwanda, footnote number 2, I'll get back to that, where there are different chiefs on the same territorial level, chiefs for taxation on cattle and chiefs for taxation on land, military commanders and high chiefs, the delegation is obviously restricted to certain parts of the total authority. Following Southall, one could say that in the case of total delegation, the structure is one of a pyramid of authority, where every focus at each level is similar to the others. In cases where there is no blanket delegation, there is no simple pyramidal structure, but a structure of hierarchy. So 1 and 3. 2 and 3. So 2 just points you to another paper or chapter, the premise of inequality in Rwanda. 3 points you to another paper. And do we get to 4 just now? No. So the principle of delegation implies that the chief is the representative of the king for his subjects. But for the king, he is the representative of the people. And this second aspect of the position of chiefs and headmen is very real. For chiefs depend on their subjects in a number of ways, the most important of which is their need for military service and labor from them. Let's highlight that. For chiefs depend on the subjects in a number of ways, the most important of which is their need for military service and labor from them. Now, it is general in this type of political structure that subjects may move from one chiefdom or village to another if they find the chief's or headman's rule too harsh. The chiefs and headmen are therefore in competition amongst themselves to attract more subjects. That's a very interesting point, right? It tells you that, and then, you know, I've talked about this in the past. When you're talking about being organized, for example, there's a business component. You have to conduct business in a sense. You know, I was talking to a sister the other day about human resources, right? And this is kind of that. Like, this is when you understand that people, right, that the people, the talent, make the business, right? The chiefs and the headmen, they knew that, they understood that there was competition. And they understood that they had to do the work, I imagine, to retain the best people in their regions, right? And we go about life today as Black folks, and we are not doing the work to understand that we have to retain the best talent to our causes. In y'all's Bible, right? Y'all have a story about a guy named Saul, whose name was later converted to Paul, right? Now, I'm not going to get to that whole story because it's just ridiculous, but one of the ideas that comes from that story, or from that person, is that he was supposedly this high-ranking Jew, right, who understood their laws, etc., inside and out. And when he had his conversion, right, he was able to destroy Judaism because he understood their laws so well. That's the thing you gotta do with your own people. When you have Black folks breaking ranks and going over to the other side, that's a part of what's going on. They, you know, when you look at Candace Owens and Larry Elder and stuff like that, they are trying to destroy and denigrate Black people from having been inside of the community. When you look at Tommy Sotomayor, I can't believe I'm mentioning him because I haven't heard about him in a while now. But when you look at the guys like Tommy Sotomayor, that's what they're doing. They're Black guys who are looking at some of the chaos that occurs inside of our community, right? And they're using that to suck up to these other folks, these white folks. You see? Because they know that there's no competition occurring in Black society to retain them to Black causes. So again, I'll say to you guys, go back and look it up in the past. I did that episode on how we need to take a business approach to organizing and stuff like that. That's the thing that we have to keep in mind. I talked about it in the last episode a couple of days ago. You know, not only do you have to be competitive in terms of keeping the best of us on our side, doing the work for us, but you also, right, as I mentioned last time, I mentioned in terms of the people who are protecting you, right, the people who are defending, you know, your nation, you have to treat them very well, right, to keep them retained to do your work. But it's the same is true for even the thought people, the people who are doing the thinking, the people who are doing the writing. You have to keep them on your side. What's the name, for those of you listening live in the chat room, what's the name of the Negro sellout that all Candace Owens and Larry Elder and you know, the Sotomayors and them name drop all the time? He's like the father of all the sellouts. I forgot his name. He's a smart guy, to be honest, because I've read some of his work. But again, he was one of those guys. He's old now. He's like 90. Damn, I forgot his name. But he's one of those guys who, you know, you would have needed to get to him before he went to Columbia. He went to Columbia and stuff like that. Before he went to Columbia and stuff, you need to get to him, because those are the kind of minds, smart guys, who can be corrupted and who can work against you. You know, I'll check in the chat room later to see if you guys could remember. I can't remember the guy's name right now. So to continue, thus they have to take into consideration, and they are the true representatives of the interests of the communities which they lead. Their actions will then be motivated by demands of the king or higher chiefs on the one hand, and on the other by the wishes of their subjects. And it is a good chief's duty to conciliate both. The recognition by a chief or headman of his political dependence upon the king or other higher ranked chiefs is symbolized by the payment of what we will call tribute of allegiance. The acceptance of this tribute is the recognition by the king or higher ranked chief of the lower rank headman or chief as a legitimate holder of the delegated authority. This tribute of allegiance has generally very limited economic value and obvious symbolic connotations. It will include the surrender of parts of animals or the whole of animals which are equated symbolically with sovereign kinship. It often includes the skins of leopards or lions, the bodies of pangolins, civet cats and eagles, the trunk, one tusk, and the tail tuft of elephants, one horn of buffaloes, one tusk or one hinder quarter of hippopotami, and so on. By the way, the pangolin is funny. I always thought of that as kind of an Asian creature, but the pangolin is what was what people claim these Asians were eating, right? Like wild meat that caused the COVID-19 thing. At least in the beginning, the pangolin was the supposed vector of COVID-19. Thomas Sowell. It's Thomas Sowell. That's the guy's name. He's the chief Boon Coon for which a lot of the sellouts that you see out here now, that's who they reference all the time. Thomas Sowell. Where was I? The killer of the animal has to surrender the noble parts to his headman, who will hand them over to the sub-chief, and then upwards until the tribute of allegiance reaches the king. Failure to do so is an act of rebellion and can lead immediately to civil war. Indeed, it can be said that it is a typical act of rebellion in many kingdoms. I may have missed some footnotes here, probably not. But in this footnote here, it says, with the southeastern Bantu and with the Kuba, refusal to hand over the tribute of allegiance is often a cliche, used to explain why states split in the past. Oh, okay. So interesting. Okay. So when folks decide they're not sticking around in this group anymore, they're gonna do their own thing. They'll just claim that, you know, so and so didn't hand over the tribute of allegiance, and that's why. Okay. All right. The significance of this tribute is clearly non-economic and thus different from the more general tribute and taxes. Everywhere stress is laid upon the allegiance, which the surrender of these animals implies, and animals are linked with kinship, either because the parts surrendered are insignia of kinship, or because the animals symbolize absolute authority in some spheres of the animal world, or because they symbolize war. My ears always perk up when I see them mention war. So there's a footnote here for symbolizing war that says this has only been studied in detail for the Kuba, and evidence will be published later. Let me quickly look up something real quick. So the Kuba Kingdom, also known as the Kingdom of the Bakuba or Bushongo, is a traditional kingdom in Central Africa. Okay. So this is a Central African kingdom. Good to know. All right. But so far the data do not show clearly that this tribute is linked with the ritual prosperity of the country, although in one case it seems to be linked to the land. When it says linked to the land, there's a citation that says that when an elephant is killed in Tswana territory, the first tusk to strike the ground is for the king. In consequence, we call this tribute of allegiance and not ritual tribute. All kingdoms exhibit some form of taxation, and nearly all of them demand tribute. And that's the thing, you know. I'll talk about that later, but taxation is important to really fund a kingdom. So when you hear people complain about taxation, sometimes they go too far. Taxation is necessary. The level of taxation can be oppressive. All kingdoms exhibit some form of taxation, and nearly all of them demand tribute, labor, and indirect taxes from their subjects. This can be seen as the price the individual has to pay in order to enjoy the protection of the state, and this is often stressed with relation to market taxation or dues for courts. The tribute is collected yearly by local officials under supervision of higher-ranked chiefs. The amount to be paid is estimated for each of the smallest political divisions of the kingdom, be it villages or neighborhoods. When the assessment is made by the kings and higher-ranking chiefs, attention is often paid to the productive capacity of each unit in terms of the number of huts in existence, with reference to other factors as well. In the Luapula area, for instance, an old established village has to pay more than a newly founded one because, in the latter case, the inhabitants still have to clear extensive tracts of bush, and the yield of their crops will be lower than the one in the first. All right. So let's look at that one more time. When the assessment is made by the kings and the higher-ranking chiefs, attention is often paid to the productive capacity of each unit in terms of the number of huts in existence and with reference to other factors as well. In the Luapula area, for instance, an old established village has to pay more than a newly founded one because the newly founded one The inhabitants still have to clear extensive tracts of bush, and the yield of their crops would be lower than the old establishment. Okay, makes sense. There's a footnote here that says, well, it just basically sends you to a paper or book chapter called The Lupula Peoples of Northern Rhodesia. Moreover, tribute is always required in the form of goods, which are products of local specialization if there are regional differences in economic production. Thus, with the Kuba, the Payang pay tribute in iron knives, Twa hunters pay in meat, fishermen in fish, in Giende in raffia cloth, and so on. I remember in the Caribbean when I was a kid coming up, raffia cloth was still a big deal, actually. Tribute generally includes food and or goods. Once tribute is collected by a local chief, he hands it over to a higher ranking chief and so up the pyramid until it reaches the capital and the king. But each of the intermediary chiefs has a right to retain some proportion of it. Compulsory labor is called for as needed, but by any official in his territory. It is used mainly for the creation and upkeep of the fields of main chiefs or kings, for the upkeep of roads and buildings with an official character, including the huts of headmen, chiefs, and monarchs, for the transportation of tribute or the carrying out of messages and similar duties. So, in the book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, right? Rodney talks about how, there's this claim, and I saw there's a black minister. I played him on an episode back in the day on this show too. There's this black minister in Harlem. I don't remember his name. If you guys in the chat room do remember, let me know. But this guy was saying stuff like, this black guy was saying stuff like, black American guy, by the way, was saying stuff about how Africans didn't build nothing, they didn't do nothing. It was the European or this white man who came and gave you all this stuff. And Walter Rodney tells you in his book that, and it's also said in the book that we did about the Congo there. It's also said that in that book that, these Africans had roads. As a matter of fact, these roads and the infrastructure they had was even better than a lot of places in Europe at the time. But some of you guys still today are anti-African, or at least you're Afrophobic, because you think that Africa is a downgrade, right? Africa is a downgrade to you being a population inside of this People's American nation, right? But Africa has always been on it. Had it not been for the works of Europe and Africa, Africa would be a model nation, the model nation on planet Earth. But like me and Carl Hezekiah used to say on the old shows discussing those books, when you're being basically hunted, right? When you're being pursued by an enemy, right? You don't have time to innovate. You don't have time to come out with the next great invention. Your concern is survival. Your concern is how we're going to protect our people, how we're going to eat. And that's why Africa has been in this predicament. When you look at all the natural resources in Africa, the intelligence of our people, all we got to do is get this thing. And when I say all, by the way, I don't mean it as lightly as I'm saying it, right? But what we got to do is get organized. Tribute generally includes food and or goods. Once tribute is collected by a local chief, he hands it over to a higher ranking chief and so up the pyramid until it reaches the capital and the king. But each of the intermediary chiefs has a right to retain some proportion of it. Compulsory labor is called for as needed by any official in his territory. It is used mainly for the creation and upkeep of the fields of main chiefs or kings, for the upkeep of roads and buildings with an official character, including the huts of headsmen, chiefs, and monarchs, for the transportation of tribute, for the carrying out of messages and similar duties. Taxes are paid by market users for the use of the facilities of the market, or even for any commercial transaction in the market. Tolls exist in some areas on roads. And bridges. Dues have to be paid when bringing a case to court, and fines are often imposed in courts. Another source of revenue is the king's or the chief's claims to intestate property. The produce of all these sources of income goes to the king, but part of it is retained by the collectors, the officials in charge of the markets, or of the toll stations, the judges, and so on. Right? This collection of revenue is necessary to the economic functioning of this type of political system. All the representatives of the kingdom are specialized officials and need to be maintained in a higher or lesser degree by their subjects according to their degree of specialization. A headman, for instance, may do some cultivation, but a king or a chief may not, both because his time is occupied by political matters, because he has to maintain a certain prestige. So this tells you that, you know, our people in these kingdoms weren't simple people. You know, people would like you to believe that, you know, whatever kingdoms we had were kind of haphazard, and nah. Our people, you know, had governments, had organizations. I mean, they really had nations, right? And they understand this is before any, you know, any contact with the other folks, right? They had it going on. They had it going on. And so this is the kind of stuff you should revel in, right? You should look at this and say, hey, we are not second class anything, right? We come from a rich history. And we should respect that, and we should use that to bolster even our own self-esteem. I want to thank you guys again for joining me tonight as I read this paper. Yeah, I'm just seeing only to say had said Thomas Sowell. Yeah, Thomas Sowell was the guy. Right. Thanks for joining me. Make sure you like. If you're new here today, make sure to subscribe. If you're unapologetic about who you are and what you believe in, and as far as being an African, make sure to share this content to your social media. Don't be afraid, right? Share it to your social media. And again, thanks for being here. Let's continue. This collection of revenue is necessary to the economic functioning of this type of political system. All the representatives of the kingdom are specialized officials and need to be maintained in a higher or lesser degree by their subjects according to the degree of specialization. I think I read this. A headman, for instance, may do some cultivation, but a king or a chief may not, both because his time is occupied by political matters and because he has to maintain a certain prestige. All the representatives of authorities derive wealth from the system. It has often been claimed that since goods received by any chief are redistributed amongst his followers, he does not seem to be much wealthier than they. But this is plainly wrong. Certainly most of the goods are redistributed, but wealth resides not in the retention of goods, but in the general control of production. That's a lesson right there. That's a lesson right there. That's where the wealth is, right? When you have other people in control of the production of your goods, that you might see, you know, depending on where you are in that chain, you might see some resources come your way, but that's not the real wealth. The real wealth is in the people who control the production. And every chief controls to a variable degree labor and its output. The goods he receives are invested, not in straightforward economic investments, but in what could be called social investments. Retainers have to stick to their patrons and to give them service whenever they need it, so that the return on a chief's gifts consists in the control of more labor, in the general support of his people, in political matters, and in a high degree of prestige, which in this system serves to back up authority. This is shown very well in the Rwanda kingdom. Here, tribute is often paid in cattle. Cattle could have been kept in herds by the king or his chiefs, and the direct return would have been the increase of the herd. But cattle are not retained. They are lent to clients who have then to perform labor and general assistance when the donor needs them. Moreover, the donor's status and his prestige are enhanced by his donations. The returns from an investment like this are far higher than any increase in the original herd could have been. But the most important significance of the collection of tribute, labor, and taxes, in our view, that is the only way to back up rank with corresponding wealth and prestige, and that authority could only be exercised if a corresponding measure of prestige were attached to it. Interesting. Just the judicial system of African kingdoms also show basic resemblances which are linked to the pattern of delegation of powers. The headman, chief, or king is always a judge and has a court. Appeals can be made from lower to higher courts. There is a notion of public welfare and a distinction between civil and criminal offenses, although it does not tally entirely with current European concepts. Let's repeat that again. There is a notion of public welfare and a distinction between civil and criminal offenses, although it does not tally entirely with current European concepts. In most kingdoms, moreover, there are reserved cases which can only be tied by special courts. Generally, an offense which might lead to the execution of the offender is reserved for the king's court. Generally, an offense which might lead to the execution of the offender is reserved for the king's court, for he alone has the right to life and death. The use of judicial oracles administered by technical specialists who are not judges themselves is also widespread, but as yet it is not possible to go much further than these generalities, since so few of the legal systems of these kingdoms have been closely studied. With regard to military organization, comparison is even more difficult, since little is known about it. Standing armies are rare. We talked about this before. General conscription seems also to have been exceptional. Soldiers were recruited when needed, almost in the same way as ordinary laborers would have been. A military hierarchy is found in Southeast Africa and in the interlacustrine areas. In Central African, military titles also existed. Campaigns were almost always seasonal affairs and were not directed towards the destruction of the enemy's army. What what was intended was either the taking of loot or the incorporation of new chiefdoms into the state, right? So we established this recently when we talked about military and traditional African societies, right? That, you know, the reasons for war is much different. Well, the reasons for war are different than what you see today, all right? A widely recurrent but not universal feature is the existence at the top of the state structure of one or several councils which balance the power wielded by the king. With regard to most matters, unanimity has to be reached in the council, and its decisions are then binding, although the king can protest against them. In most cases, the king's decisions have to be approved by the council, and the propositions of the councils have to be agreeable to the king. But neither the king nor the councils can rule alone. Membership in the councils may include territorial chiefs, hereditary officials, and appointees by the king. Some members from a group of religious specialists and hold their titles by right of inheritance. Within the council themselves, there is a body of followers of the king and a body of people who could oppose him when they thought that his intentions were conflicting with those of the monarchy at large or with the welfare of his subjects. We have few data about the actual functioning of these councils. Lobbying and pressure groups must be assumed, and the composition of council membership shows that a basis for them exists in most of the kingdom. So when you listen to this, you should hear, you know, something that sounds, you know, a lot like what you see, you know, in other regions of the world, right? Something that sounds very organized, very thought out. And that's kind of what I want to get across to you guys, that your ancestors weren't just some folks running around naked in bushes. And I know by now most of you know that, but a lot of us still aren't aware of it. But when you read this last line, lobbying and pressure groups, and I mean, that's what you hear right now. Like if you're in the US, for example, you hear that right now in terms of how your government works. And we're talking about like traditional or more ancient African kingdoms. You should never hang your head for being an African. We went through a fall, but that doesn't mean we're not great. Is double question mark in the chat room today? Is double question mark on the live? I was wondering if he was going to interject in some way that was totally not related to what I was talking about. But shout out to double question mark to that brother or sister. I'm not even sure if it's a guy or a girl, but shout out to that African. Let's hope that all is well with double question mark. 3 other characteristics of African kingdoms have to do with their character as conquest states. Probably all the African kingdoms have been enlarged by conquest. In all instances, it is said that conquest started from a nucleus, and generally that the impetus to it was given by an immigrant group, be it large or small. That's interesting. Right? Probably all the African kingdoms have been enlarged by conquest. In all instances, it is said that conquest started from a nucleus, and generally that the impetus to it was given by an immigrant group, be it large or small. From the nucleus, the state extended itself by actual military conquest or threat of conquest. How the nuclei themselves first became organized as kingdoms is more obscure. We cannot assume that this was through military action, if only because the potential military force of the early kingdom was composed of its own citizens, but by conviction that a kingdom was the best and indeed the only way to regulate the political life of the community. See, our ancestors understood this. There's a footnote here that says, L. Shapira makes this clear for South Africa. The nucleus is so old that nobody remembers its origin, but conquest explains much of the territorial organizations in the actual states. A. Southall shows that, the author Southall shows that acceptance of domination is an important factor in every expression of a political structure over an alien structure. Acceptance of domination is an important factor in every extension of a political structure over an alien structure. But when he says that genuine ethnographic evidence is poor, but when he says that, quote, genuine ethnographic evidence is poor, but Oberg and Gluckman assume a conquest origin for the Banyankole and Zulu as Nadal tends to do for the Nupe. We disagree. Most of the evidence relating to the histories of African kingdoms points to conquest. In the case of the Alur, the expansion began by the occupation of foreign land, that is, by a form of conquest. And there seems to have been fighting. Later on, other foreign groups accepted or asked for Alur chiefs as peacemakers in order to settle their feuds. But it is also possible that they did this in order to be protected from Alur raids which plagued them, that is, under indirect pressure. Southall, in Alur society, stresses the longing of foreign groups for Alur chiefs. We would stress the indirect pressure and say that this also is a form of conquest. I mean, that's the thing about, when we had that conversation with the Pro-Black Perspective podcast with Ointase, we talked about, what are the things you want to stress in a pamphlet urging Black folks to organize, to become organized and join an organization, a Pan-African organization. And one of the things I had mentioned was you want to give them the benefits early on. And one of the benefits I only kind of say put up there, if memory serves me correct, was along the lines of protection, right? Sometimes, in fact, most times, it's advantageous for you to be organized, to be smart enough, right? To be sensible enough to join an organization, right? To join an organized group for protection, right? You gotta join, even if it's just for protection. Makes no sense to be a population within a nation getting destroyed, and you're not organizing in a pan view, in a Pan-African view, right? Even if it's just for the idea of protection. Hopefully I can remember where I was in this reading. Right. This ideal model of a kingdom was, of course, a legacy from earlier kingdoms. We cannot tell how the first kingdoms came into being, since kingdoms have existed in Africa for a very long time. Right? This Indian author, I think it's an Indian, is telling you kingdoms, right, with all of his organization to organize a kingdom, has existed in Africa for a very long time. And that video I was going to show you was going to talk about, a lot of the different kingdoms there were in Africa. For example, it was intended to discuss the Mali Empire, the Kingdom of Kush, the Songhai Empire, the Kingdom of Aksum, the Kingdom of Zimbabwe. right? If you, as a matter of fact, I'll just read some stuff here now. The Mali Empire, the Great Mali Empire began in the 1200s by Sundiata Keita, sometimes referred to as Lion King. The Mali Empire was known for being the epicenter of trade, elaborate mosque, Islamic schools, Islamic schools, and simply for being a world of luxury and riches. One of the great leaders of the empire, Mansa Musa, had so much gold that he passed it out to poor along his Hajj to Mecca. The Mali Empire was so rich through trade that by the 14th century, it was the source of almost half the old world's gold exported from West Africa. The empire was also home to Sankara Madrasa, one of the greatest centers of learning, and housed the largest library in Africa at the time with an estimated 700,000 manuscripts. The Kingdom of Kush, the ancient Nubian Empire, ruled over a vast territory along the Nile River in what is modern-day Sudan, starting from around 785 BC, before clowns. This kingdom was so powerful that it even ruled its famous neighbor to the north, Egypt, as the 25th dynasty, which meant the monarchs of Kush were also the pharaohs of Egypt. The Kingdom of Kush thrived for over 1,000 years and was a center of trade for iron and gold. The Kushites also mummified their dead and built their own types of pyramids. In fact, the ancient Kushite capital of Meroe is home to ruins of over 200 pyramids, far more than Egypt. The Songhai Empire. This large West African kingdom, which this paper doesn't talk about West African kingdoms, but it assumes similarities with North, South, and East African kingdoms, right? But the Songhai Empire, the large West African kingdom, was formed in the 15th century and encompassed a dozen of modern-day African nations. The capital of this massive empire was the city of Gao, which was located in modern-day Mali. Its greatest leader was King Mohammed Askaya, also known as Askaya the Great, who expanded the reach of the kingdom and established hundreds of Islamic schools in Timbuktu. Why do they always talk about the Islamic? Whatever. He also opened his court to scholars and poets from throughout the Muslim world. He advocated for learning and rewarded professors with large pensions. The Songhai Empire, and these aren't, ancient African kingdoms, but they're examples of African kingdoms that you should be aware of. The Songhai Empire was divided into 5 provinces, each led by a governor, which governor, to me, the idea is what we've been reading about these chiefs, right? These chiefs and headmen, right? The Songhai Empire also had a hand in slave trade in Africa and with European powers. Slaves were sold off to be indentured servants, but many argue that the slavery that Africans knew is far different from the slavery of the Americans. The Kingdom of Aksum. During the times of the Roman Empire, another influential empire was thriving in East Africa. The Kingdom of Aksum was a trading giant whose gold and ivory created a vital link between ancient Europe and the Far East. It was one of the first empires in the world to adopt Christianity and was one of the 4 most powerful empires in the world at the time. The Kingdom of Aksum also developed its own written script known as KWAZ, one of the first in Africa, and had its own unique architectural style. The fifth and last kingdom is the Kingdom of Zimbabwe. Established around 1220, the Kingdom of Zimbabwe expanded artistic and stonemasonry traditions to impressive levels. Elaborate stone buildings were built, and trade with Asia and Arabic partners thrived in this kingdom that was greatly influenced by the Kingdom of Mapungubwe in southern Africa. Mapungubwe. The medieval city of Great Zimbabwe served as the capital of the kingdom. That is where the name of the impeccably built buildings are found today. So that video I attempted to show to play early on, covered those kingdoms. So I just wanted to detour for a second, just to let you know what had been in store early on. Where was I? Where was I? Was I still on the footnotes? Okay, no, I started talking about being organized after the footnote. And the third footnote says that, okay, so after I read this part here, we cannot tell how the first kingdoms came into being, since kingdoms have existed in Africa for a very long time. I talked about that, and that had a footnote that just says that there's a paper that describes an East African kingdom around 900 AD. Okay, the process of conquest itself is complicated. For conquest means not only to defeat enemies, but also to integrate them. That is, to make the enemy accept the loss of independence. Do the Europeans operate that way? Right? The process of conquest itself is complicated. For conquest means not only to defeat the enemy, but also to integrate them. That is, to make the enemy accept the loss of independence. The incorporation of enemies becomes even more complex if they themselves have not had a state structure before their defeat. For then it is not merely a matter of making the enemy accept his subjection, but also of teaching him to adopt a new political organization. Such a situation existed in northern Rwanda before 1900. The conqueror brought colonies in from the nucleus and settled them in the province to act as a permanent police force as administrative officials of newly created territorial units. In Rwanda, this policy failed, but a similar technique used by the Lunda in some of their conquests met with success. The Fung, whose problem was the incorporation of an enemy kingdom, left a standing army to garrison the country. But the new province did not integrate itself in the kingdom, which led in time to the destruction of the whole kingdom. Yeah, that's the thing. That the idea of incorporating like a quote-unquote foreign group into your established nation, for them to accept the loss, right? The loss of conquest. That's a tall order, right? That can be a tall order, right? So we saw in this group here, the Fung, they did it, and it led to the destruction of the whole kingdom. And this has a footnote that just leads us to a paper. In other similar cases, assimilation can be brought about by indirect rule. The vanquished people rule themselves, but the chiefs pay obeisance to the conqueror king, right? Even that is difficult, because what stops that group from getting organized while not under the everyday rule of the conquering kingdom, right? And typically, vanquished people are angry. Their growth as conquest states explains why in any kingdom one finds a nuclear area in which the administrative organization differs considerably from that of the outlying areas. In a great number of cases, moreover, the king is the immediate ruler of the central nucleus, while the provinces the provinces are governed by chiefs. A. Southall has called this phenomenon the shading off of territorial sovereignty, and cites cases where peripheral units owe allegiance to two different kingdoms, for the authority of the king becomes weaker and weaker with increasing distance from the nucleus. That just makes sense. Although Southall sees these characteristics as typical of segmentary states, other cases are known, such as in Central Africa, the Congo, Cuba, Luba, and Lunda, so that to us, they seem to be typical of nearly all the African states. And so that, you know, there lies the other thing too, right? And I think this is often the issue when you have folks who think that there's a long game to be played like in America or outside of Africa, that you could build nations in other people's nation or what have you outside of Africa. And, you know, you've heard me say this before too, you want to have an Africa that's powerful enough that can extend and give some protections to its people. But even though I'm saying that and I believe in that, I do understand the difficulty in that, right? There's a difficulty in having control the further away from the nation, right? And we see that here. I mean, they're talking about it in terms of kings, but let's transfer this thought in terms of nation, right? The reason why America has bases, you know, military bases in all these other people's countries, which is amazing to me, by the way, which is absolutely amazing to me that was allowed, right? But the reason why they have these bases all over the place is that's the extension of their power. The reason why the U.S. puts so much money into military funding every year and into military research, right, is to maintain its reach, is to maintain its power across the world. So if you're going to build an African nation, you have to keep that in mind. And that's going to be the difficulty, to be able to have the reach across the world to protect, you know, her people across the world. That's going to be the difficulty, which in the end is why ultimately, and I've said this before, our people have to make their way back to the continent, a strong, unified powerhouse of a continent of Africa. This last point I made about for the authority of the king becomes weaker and weaker with increasing distance from the nucleus. Although Southall sees this characteristics as typical of segmentary states, there's a footnote here. Other cases are known as such in Central Africa, the Congo, Cuba, and by Cuba I'm talking about in Central Africa, Luba and Lunda, so that to us they seem to be typical of nearly all African states. This footnote, number 2, okay, it just takes you back to one of Southall's papers, so there's no expansion of knowledge there. The extent of the conquest has of course determined the territorial size and the population of a given kingdom. Some are very large, such as the Lunda Empire, or are very populous, such as Rwanda, and with its 2 million, such as Rwanda with its 2 million inhabitants. Others have remained quite small in size, like the Bamileke kingdoms, or have broken down into small kingdoms like the Malanje district chiefdoms, but as long as the essential structural features are still there, both a kingdom not larger than a village or two, and a huge kingdom like the ancient Mali are comparable, right? conquest has, so there's a footnote here that's after that note that says, if the structural characteristics of a state are present in a political community, it is a state, no matter how big or small it is. I'll formulate, is that right? Sorry. Conquest has resulted also in cultural heterogeneity, which is now typical for many kingdoms. This is important for the economies of these states because regional specialization flourishes and is often coupled with a brisk trade carried on through an elaborate market system. The contact of different cultures also favors innovations, especially at the center of the monarchy, and the political structure favors the spread of innovations amongst its component cultures. That's an interesting point here. This paragraph is interesting. Right? So when you have these conquests, of course, you're going to have different people. So it's not going to be a homogeneous society anymore. It's going to be heterogeneous. Right? Which is typical of a kingdom, especially a kingdom that has expanded due to conquest. Right? But this has an important outcome, right? Because the economies of these states, right, tend to flourish when you have a sort of like diversity in these states or in these kingdoms, right? So now when you have the contact of these different cultures, what springs out of it is like you start to see innovation, right? And so, remember when I talked about, having a business approach to Black society, right? Be it organizing or just society in general. One of the things that I talked about in that episode was how in businesses, these Europeans, for example, they understand that when you hire, right, and they understand that today more than in days past, but they understand that when you hire and you pull the smart folks from different cultures together, there's going to be some innovation that comes out of that, because the way, let's say, a Bahamian or a Jamaican approaches a problem is different from someone, say, in the Congo. It's different from, say, an African in America, or an Americanized African. And what tends to occur out of like these different cultures coming together is some type of innovation, right? And innovation is good for a kingdom, right? It's good for a kingdom. And so that's another reason why, based on my last episode, that's another reason why myself personally, I want to talk to more people who are immersed in the situation in continental countries. Because by the time we sit down and we talk about our problems, and we talk about, whatever strategies we've used in our respective places, right? We'll probably come up with something innovative, right, towards nation building that will do the deed that's needed for our people, or deeds needed for our people. Our formulation of the common features in African kingdoms has been very formal and rigid, but the actual functioning of the political institutions has not generally been sufficiently described to enable us to deepen the comparison. We are, however, conscious of this limitation and appreciate that a discussion in terms of constitutions also remains unsatisfactory. An instance may stress the point. In theory, all the Kuba chiefdoms have the same length with the king and the central chiefdom. In practice, the hold of the king over them varied greatly from one chiefdom to another and from one moment to another. It is certain that, and this goes back, this point here goes back to a reading I did, if not last Saturday, the Saturday before, where we talked about, what did we talk about? Was it Ubuntu in business? But anyway, there was a table that compared the African outlook versus the European outlook. And one of the things, and it was a question from Renee in the chat room, was there was a misunderstanding. Like the way Africans look at things, you could tell is different from how Europeans look at things. Africans realize that there's inconsistencies in people, inconsistencies in relationships, etc. The European tends to run this kind of ideologue thought that everyone and everything is the same all the time. And you see this admission here, right? That the king, even though the relationships in terms of king to chieftain, king to chief is the same, things varied greatly between one chiefdom to another and the king. Right? And so even this European-minded author is telling you, like, yo, we've kind of handled this thing like, very rigidly, like Europeans do. But in reality, it's not as cut and dry as we tend to present things. And that's something we have to understand about our people. We're not all the same, but we all can work to one accord. And that's what we see in these African kingdoms. The relationships aren't quite the same between the king and his different chiefs, in different territories of the kingdom. But at the end of the day, like the redneck comedian whose name I can't remember, get it done. Just get it done. It is certain that in order to analyze the political system, it becomes necessary to recognize this and to investigate the factors which bring about such effects. The same remark holds good for the two other kingdoms with which we have been familiar, Rwanda and Burundi. Yet one cannot find more than a hint in the literature which would point to this discrepancy between theoretical constitutions and the actual patterns of government. This brings us to part 2 of the paper, a classification of African kingdoms. I want to take this time here to take a quick station ID break. I'll be back on the other side.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is VAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Just a quick reminder, I don't have a bump for her show, but there's also the Queen's Council podcast. Make sure you guys reach out to the Queen's Council. Make sure follow them on social media. It's a pretty good show. I look forward to the next episode. So we're at this part of the paper, classification of African kingdoms. In order to make a useful classification of African kingdoms, it is necessary to use criteria of differentiation which are linked with the particular structure of kingdoms, are not too complex in themselves, are not too numerous, so that an over-complicated classification can be avoided. Up to now, only one classification has been attempted. Southall has questioned the validity of an opposition between Evans, Pritchards, and Fortes as groups A and B, and argues that there is a separate category of kingdoms, segmentary kingdoms, which are morphologically transitional but do occur quite frequently in practice and must be recognized in any empirical classification. The segmentary state is characterized by territorial shading off, by centralized government, but with periphery foci over which the center has only limited control, by specialized administrative staff, repeated on a reduced scale in the peripheral foci, right? By the monopoly of the legal use of force in the center, but not at the periphery, by a pyramidal organization of authority with global delegations of authority, but with the possibility for peripheral units to adhere to several power pyramids. He classifies as segmentary states the Akoli, the Allur, the Shilluk, the Ngonde, the Ashanti, the Yoruba, the Interlacustrine Bantu, and outside Africa, such states as the Chinese Empire, the Indian and Inner Asiatic kingdoms, the Anglo-Saxon states, feudal France and Burgundy in the 11th century. So he is classifying these segmentary states of Africa to these European groups. The term segmentary state does not mean that lineage structures within the state have to contribute to the political organization as they do in the Allur case. It is their structure of a pyramid of like units which oppose each other only when they are on the same level, which is held to justify the use of the term segmentary. He cites only the Lazi as a non-segmentary kingdom because of their political divisions in non-localized groups. The footnote is to a paper. Quite apart from his elastic and confusing use of the term segmentary, yes, it is confusing, this classification is not useful for a better understanding of African states, since nearly all of them, including the Lazi, would be segmentary kingdoms and exhibit their typical features. In the case of the Lazi, Southall describes not the total structure of the kingdom, but the structure of its nucleus alone. The outer provinces were ruled by hereditary chiefs, controlled by overseers from the Lazi king. This falls clearly into the category of the segmentary kingdoms, since shading off peripheral foci and decrease of effective power from the center of the borders are all true in this case as in others. It seemed to us that two criteria were simple and significant enough to be used for the purpose of classification: the degree of centralized control and the principle of political succession. Again, we're talking about the classification of African kingdoms. So these are the two criteria that they decided upon when classifying these African kingdoms. With regard to degree of centralization, 5 forms of kingdom can be distinguished. Kingdoms where the king controls the internal and external affairs of the provinces. The kingdoms where he mainly controls the external policies but controls the provinces through a system of overseers. The third one, kingdoms where the king controls only external policies and where there is no permanent administrative link between him and the chiefs of provinces. Number 4, kingdoms where the external policy is regulated by a council of chiefs headed by the king. And number 5, kingdoms where the only authority of the king is to arbitrate in disputes between the chiefs when asked to do so. Know your history, know your destiny, right? One might add two other forms. First, states of such a small size that there is no territorial delegation of authority, so that the king is headman of a village, but where nevertheless the formal structure of the kingdom is present. Okay. We do not include these in our discussion of African states, as we think that territorial delegation of authority is an essential feature of the states we discuss. One could also set up a category of clusters of states, such as occur among the Alur, the Sukuma, or the Zandi. The kings of the petty kingdoms are related to each other by kinship ties and observe a common foreign policy with regard to enemies not belonging to their cluster. But the cluster has no head and is not a kingdom in itself, and each kingdom remains sovereign and independent, so that a cluster cannot be regarded as a single centralized political authority. Okay, that makes sense. With regard to the principles of succession, it is convenient to distinguish between the three following cases only. Number one, kingdoms where succession to subordinate territorial chiefship is hereditary in the royal line only. So you know, I think I may have misstated that last time, of the so-called royal families in Africa compared to in Europe. But I mean, in Europe, my understanding was that they thought these people were special in some way, and it seems in certain African kingdoms, they also thought that people were special in some way. Number two, kingdoms where succession to chiefship is hereditary in a set of aristocratic lineages. And number three, kingdoms where all territorial officials are appointed by the king. So that's the three criteria. Okay. One could distinguish between cases where succession is hereditary on all territorial levels and cases where headmen and or sub-chiefs are appointed. In the latter alternative, two possibilities seem to exist. Either they are appointed by superiors, the chiefs or even the king, or they are chosen by their inferiors and the choice is approved by the chief or king. In practice, these further distinctions have not been found important at this general level of classification. Right, so they're trying to keep it simple. Both proposed criteria are interrelated, type of succession being really an index to possible extent of centralization. The combination yields 5 types of kingdoms, which we discussed below, starting with the most centralized. So we start with the most centralized. Let's see how this reading takes us as African people. The despotic kingdoms are number one. The king appoints all other officials and wields absolute power in practice and in theory. Clear cases of this type of state are Rwanda, Buganda, around 1850, Bunyoro, Nkore, Soga, and Congo in the 16th century. In the case of Buganda, the king's power is shared with a central council. In the other cases, councils are less important. To you guys listening live right now, how familiar are you in your studies, right, with, you know, outside of Rwanda and Buganda, how familiar are you guys with the other kingdoms here, stated in this under the despotic kingdoms title of this paper? And again, that's why I like reading these papers, because like I'm not familiar with the Soga, for example. Now that's something that I could read up on, right? And that's my hope for everyone who listens to these episodes, either now or in the future. Man, I didn't know about the Nkore, right, or the Soga. Let me go and do my studies and see what I can learn about those about those groups, right? Number two, the regal kingdoms. The king and his chiefs belong to the same clans or to the same lineage. In cases like Burundi, Bemba, or Kiti, only members of the king's lineage and close relatives to him are chiefs. As a result of this system, a change in the command of every province has to take place at the death of each king. In other cases, as amongst the southeastern Bantu generally, the Zandi or the Alert chiefships are in the hands of persons of the royal clan, often of distinct lineages. Succession rapidly becomes hereditary in the different lineages, but the territorial divisions often have moving boundaries since each king founds new chiefdoms for his brothers or sons. In all these cases, some outlying chiefdoms are ruled by descendants of the original chiefs of the provinces before their conquest. They are thus close to the following types of kingdoms. They have been classified here because the dominant tendency is to nominate descendants of kings in the different chiefdoms. That's what makes them different from the next three groups I'm going to read about. For the same reason, the Sukuma and higher kingdoms are included here, since 94% and 82% of their chiefs are of royal origin. In this type of state, stresses within the royal clan or lineage and wars of succession are frequent and often lead to splits and secessions, as with the Zosha, Swana, Pedi, Venda, Leswalo, Sukuma, Haya, Zeni, and Alert. And that's the thing too. Like, another thing is when you talk about educating, our people, children and adults, this is the kind of stuff we want to educate them on, and we want to go into a bit more detail. Now, remember, these groups like Zosha and stuff like that, they have long histories, much of which we don't know still because of how long they've been around, right? But the idea is that you can learn from the histories of our people. And so for you guys in the chat room listening, or for anyone who comes across this episode later on YouTube or what have you, on social media, drop a book title or two or three that has given you a lot of background information on these groups, like the Zosha, the Swana, the Pedi, right? And any other group I've mentioned so far in this reading. Drop a good book, right? That allows us to understand our ancient histories in terms of these peoples and these different groups, these different kingdoms, right? Drop a book in there. I'm sure someone like Onita Say probably has a book in mind, but drop a book. So number three, the incorporative kingdoms. In these states, the chiefships are hereditary in the lineages of the Aboriginal rulers of the provinces as they were before the incorporation. In these states, the chiefships are hereditary in the lineages of the Aboriginal rulers of the provinces as they were before the incorporation. Okay. After their conquest, their administration is left undisturbed, but overseers are appointed to control them. Interesting. The overseers live near the provincial capitals and sometimes bring a colony of settlers from the nuclear area with them. In time, these colonies make the domination of the center over the provinces much more effective, since they tend to become centers of cultural and especially ideological diffusion, can also act as garrisons in times of stress. Typical cases of this type of kingdom are the Bamaliki, Lunda, Luba, and Lazi states. But despite this double system of administration, the kingdoms are liable to defection from outlying provinces, and as can be seen from the history of the last three states mentioned. Number four is the aristocratic kingdoms. The chiefs are vested in these states in hereditary lineages or clans, descending either from the aboriginal rulers of the chiefdom, from companions of the first kings, from favorites of the first kings, or occasionally from members of the royal lineage. The only link between the center and the provinces is the payment of tribute and allegiance to the king by the chiefs. In the more centralized of these states, few aboriginal aristocratic lineages have been left undisturbed in procession of their chiefdoms. In the less centralized, such as the Kuba kingdom, all the chiefs are still descendants of the aboriginal rulers, and the kingdom is little more than a protectorate from the nucleus over the outlying provinces. The secessionist tendencies of the chiefdoms are always strong and kept in check only by the superior military strength of the nucleus, by the support of a majority of the chiefs will give to the king whenever one of the provinces tend to secede, or occasionally by external pressure, which brings the provinces and the nucleus together for defense or for expansion. So that's the thing. Like, when you look at history of kingdoms and conquests and stuff like that, first to begin with, the idea that you beat another group, right, or nation or what have you, and now you have them as a protectorate, right? The idea is that you're still the more mighty military. And so again, if you want to, in terms of keeping these groups in check, because again, if you've been conquered, you particularly don't like to have been conquered. And so you're going to be that rascal, right? That's a part of one's kingdom. You're always going to be a little bit of the rascal, right? Typically speaking, every time I do an episode, almost, there's a fire truck passing by. And so the best way to keep them in line is to maintain your military might. No one wants to be twice conquered. Thus, these kingdoms are morphologically intermediate between regal kingdoms and federations. This type of state is very common in Africa, and well-known cases are the former Congo kingdom in the 17th century. In the 18th century, the Kazembe kingdom of the Luapula, the Kuba, Ngondi, Balanje, Ha, Zinka, and Shaga states, and even the Shilluk kingdom. Whenever, let me highlight this. Whenever the kingdoms are larger, they are unstable, since the tendencies to secession are then usually much stronger than the pull towards integration. When they are small, they may be quite stable, but are not necessarily so. Number 5 is the federations. The only clear case of a federation in Africa seems to be the Ashanti Union. Here, the king rules over the external affairs of the federation with a council of chiefs over which he presides. He is then only primus inter pares. The unity of a federation, just like that of an aristocratic chiefdom, is dependent upon the king's military superiority, the consent of the chiefs, and the degree of external pressure. What differentiates this from the aristocratic kingdoms is mainly the fact that the members of this type of political structure do view themselves as members of a federation, not of a unitary state. The effective centralization of the Ashanti Union has, however, been as great as, if not greater, than the centralization within most aristocratic kingdoms. That leads to a question. Like, when we're talking about nation building, what's the structure of the nation that we're building? Right? is the nation that we're dreaming of, that we're working towards. Forget dreaming about, but that we're actively working towards, right? Is this African nation, right? Does it reflect any of these five characterizations of African kingdoms of the past? Like, what is the structure of this African nation? For those of you in the chat, or for those of you who come across this video later on, this episode of the podcast later on, you know, what do you envision as the structure of the new African nation that we want to realize at some point in the next few generations of African people? This typology is a classification of structural models, the form which processual models of political development might take raises a further set of problems which cannot be considered here. Meanwhile, many statements in this article will probably have to be revised as new data are brought to bear. But it is also probable that many more correspondences will be found among African states in the field of structure, functioning, and development. And that's what my last question, right? That's what my last question is trying to tackle. Right? What is the structure of this African state that we want to realize? What is its functioning? What is and development, right? Further comparative work is needed to refine such a classification as this, but this article will have fulfilled its purpose if it has succeeded in drawing attention to the problems involved. That's the end of the paper. There is this appendix talking about the ethnographic sources. The relevant data for many of the kingdoms mentioned in this essay can be found in summarized form in the appropriate sections of the Ethnographic Survey of Africa. Okay. Perhaps that's something to look into. Some information on Rwanda, Burundi, and Cuba were collected by the author during his field work as a member of the staff of the Institut pour la Recherche Scientifique in Afrique, some French shit, right? And then he lists his sources. So that's the paper. I thought it was a pretty decent paper. I thought it was fun. I thought it also raises some questions. Going forward as an African people, what do we want to see for the new African nation, right? Peace to KW Dawn 7. He says, Sawubona. I think that means you're seen. Oh, we're together, right? KW Dawn, what's the meaning of that? That's a greeting, right? But yeah, definitely, this paper, is, the greeting that KW Dawn says, I see you, you are important to me, and I appreciate that. What language is that? Zulu, is it? Again, this was the paper, a comparison of African kingdoms. Which kingdom characterization do you think worked best historically? Which one, if any, do you think will work for us in the future. Onita says, I see, yeah, KW Don says, I see you in Zulu. Pro Black Perspective says, informative, thanks, I appreciate you. The Pro Black Perspective says, yeah, that immigrant group comment was real interesting. That immigrant group comment was really interesting. Right? So yeah, that was the paper. If you guys have any other comments or questions, give them now. I'll read them on air. If not, I'll see you guys again on Tuesday. Is there any other comments, questions, shout outs? You know, my shout out is to the Pro Black Perspective. My shout out is to KW Don 7. I don't see them here today, but my shout out is a double question mark. Double question mark hit me with a question and demanded my answer last time because he gave me a like. I appreciate the like. I have given you my like. I expect a answer to my question. God damn, brother. I understand you're African, but let's not be that now. You know? Yeah, so anyway, thanks guys for tuning in. Seems like there's no more questions and comments. Thanks guys for tuning in. Remember to check out the Pro Black Perspective. I'm pretty sure the brother Onita Say will have his worship going on tomorrow, so make sure seek him out, figure out what time it's happening. He had 2 recent episodes. Make sure to check those out as well. I know that the Harsh Reality podcast is cooking up something new. I saw them talk about it in a recent social media post. And you know me, I've been trying to do these episodes 3 times a week these days. Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. So I shall be back on Tuesday. I haven't figured out the topic quite yet. I do have an idea. So, you know, make sure tune in once again. Like I said, if you're new to this channel and you haven't done so already, make sure to hit me a like, give me a subscribe, click the bell for notifications. And if you're unapologetic about who you are, what you are as an African, make sure to share this episode to your social media to engage other people, to have discussions with them about the topic. And until next time, guys, this has been your boy Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Thanks for listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast with your host, Koku. If you like what you just heard, we hope you pass along our web address, bittermedicineblogs.com, to your friends and colleagues, and share our show to all your social media. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. This has been a KWAZ radio production. Join us next time for another session of the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Follow us on Facebook at Bitter Medicine Show, Twitter, Bitter Meds, Tumblr, Bitter Meds, Instagram, Bitter Medicine.